Now for our newspaper review, when Sally and I have a look to see what's making headlines around the world this hour, and we start with the International New York Times, which quote the US Attorney General imploring more European countries to adopt American-style counter-terrorism laws.
The Japan Times covers Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's visit to Australia, where the Japanese leader said he hopes to craft a special relationship.
And the business section of the International New York Times looks at the fallout from news that Germany's second largest lender, Commerzbank, faces a $500 million fine. It's for violating sanctions on trading with Iran and other countries.
The Daily Telegraph front page illustrates the pain of defeat for football-mad Brazilians after their team 7-1 thrashing at the hands of Germany in the World Cup semi-finals last night.
Oh, just look at that picture there. The China Daily investigates figures which reveal a tenfold increase in the number of Chinese tourists travelling abroad for trophy safari hunting.
And the Financial Times details a product placement deal that's gone very wrong indeed. Film studio Paramount is being sued by a Chinese nature reserve after it believed it wasn't sufficiently promoted in a movie. Sounds like a minefield.
More on that and all of our stories. Going to talk them through with Mark Davies, the CEO of strategy consultancy at Camberton. Good to see you this morning, Mark.
Morning, Sally.
Let's begin by looking at the International New York Times and the US apparently urging Europeans to get tougher on terrorism.
How much tougher can we get?
Exactly.
Interesting. It talks about the fact that we need to use undercover stings. I can't believe that we don't use undercover stings already to deal with anti-terrorism.
Because presumably they're undercover, so we don't know about them.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's a very good point. Well made, Alice. What we see when we talk about anti-terrorism stuff is what happens at the airports, and obviously that's your lead story. It's getting worse and worse. I mean, at some point we're going to have to all go through probably completely naked when we go through the airports because it doesn't seem that it can get any worse than it currently is. And this is a little bit more serious. It's perhaps talking about the need to do things like extraordinary rendition, to hold people without trial, the sort of things that the Bush administration became famous for, which I thought that we probably moved away from a little bit with Obama.
Well, this is a resounding endorsement of those policies.
It is.
Those very policies introduced in 2001 under President George W. Bush. But this very specifically refers to foreign fighters who have perhaps gone to Syria and have been radicalised and are now potentially returning to the West and the threat that they pose.
Yes, and it's about trying to stop them going in the first place, which is why they talk about the undercover stings. But again, it's hard to know what we could do in this country more than we're doing already. If you think about how our terrorism laws have been tightened in recent years, we had the Terrorism Act of 2006, there was another one in 2011. And every time there is debate around this, the idea that you can hold people without trial or stop people from moving out of the country always is extremely contentious in this country.
All right, we'll watch that with interest. Let's have a look at the Japan Times front page. Of course, on their front page as well was the Neoruguri, which was roaring across the region yesterday. That was our top story yesterday. But also they've got Shinzo Abe's visit to Australia. Japan, Australia, OK free trade, defence deals, a special relationships being crafted. That's a phrase we're very used to here in the UK when we talk about the US and the UK, aren't we?
I think this is a very interesting story for two reasons. One is the Australia-Japan piece rather than Australia-China. Because Tony Abbott, now in charge in Australia, when Kevin Rudd was in charge, he made a great play of his connections with China, the fact that he spoke Chinese, he wanted to do a big thing. Obviously, there's a lot of tension between China and Japan at the moment over the Senkaku Islands. So I think it's interesting in that regard that Japan is getting closer to Australia. From a British perspective, I think it's very interesting because this is precisely the sort of trade deal that we can't do in this country because we have to do it through the EU. I was actually talking to a cabinet minister the other day who said to me, I've just come back from a country who would do a trade deal with us tomorrow if we had the chance. They can't, because of our position in the European Union. Of course, it's of the moment, that particular story, because of the potential referendum and where we stand with the President of the European Commission. So I think this story is very interesting for two reasons. Australia is changing its positioning. Japan is slightly playing with its positioning with China and what it says about our own.
But also as well, sorry, Alice, Japan is very much trying to show its position internationally, isn't it? Because, of course, Barack Obama recently visited Japan, and again, it was all about how Japan and the US can work together more. Now, Shinzo Abe's in Australia. It's almost like they're very much pushing themselves much more on the international stage than they have been in recent years.
Well, they are, which is why I say the context of where they are vis-a-vis China is extremely interesting, because all the talk about trade in recent years has been China, China, China. Then there is the dispute that they are having from a defence perspective and from a geopolitics perspective. And Japan are clearly trying to regain that position of ascendancy, which for a long time they had over the Chinese, and which they've lost in the last decade or so.
Very interesting.
Let's move on now and look at the business pages of the International New York Times and this potential fine for two German banks, Commerzbank and for Deutsche. What do you make of this, particularly in the wake of that record fine we saw against BNP Paribas?
Yeah, I think what's interesting about this is the way that the markets reacted to it, because Commerzbank shares fell substantially yesterday. They fell by nearly 6% at one point. They did recover to around 3.5%, but as a result of what happened, they dragged the whole index down. Now, you're right, the BNP fine, 8.9 billion, that was, so substantially larger than is expected from Commerzbank, which is expected to be around the 500 million, perhaps to a billion range. But Commerzbank obviously doesn't have anything like the depth of resource that BNP does. And what this flags is that there are still problems in the European banking system that exist, which could come from left field, which could destabilise the situation, which perhaps we thought we got past. We've had the worst of the crisis, and yet if too many fines like this come out, then there isn't the stability that we need to allow these banks to take.
Because, of course, these fines have been imposed because these banks have apparently been doing dealings with countries under US sanctions, Sudan, Iran, etc. But
Exactly.
do you think that we might begin to see a backlash from European banks saying that the fines are too large, that they're disproportionate, that America's being heavy-handed?
Yeah, I mean, in the case of Commerzbank, it's expected to be around about $500 million. So it's significantly different to BNP Paribas. I mean, BNP Paribas was quite a standout case, wasn't it? But the other thing as well, I think, in this article it says Commerzbank had put aside the amount that they need. But the question as well is, of course, all these European banks are having to increase their capital reserves to meet new regulatory guidelines. And if they're paying out fines as well, no doubt legal bills as well.
Which is
There's
why
less
the
to give
reaction
out
is so
to
interesting.
businesses and to Joe Blogs who are looking for mortgages and what have you. There's this whole kind of credit crunch issue.
The fact that the shares fell as far as they did, despite the fact they've made these provisions, shows that people are obviously worried about the basic raison d'etre.
The broader implications here.
Now, Mark, did you watch it last night? I have to admit, I had to turn away. It was just upsetting.
I've seen it before when I play my dad's five-a-side game. I mean, it's the only time
I was going to say, have you? I thought this was record
the only time you see people score every time they get the ball. I mean, there was a 6-minute period yesterday where the Germans scored 4 times. It's unbelievable. It's absolutely like a park game. And this is the picture that's been chosen for the Daily Telegraph, but there were so many pictures that they could have chosen yesterday.
The tears dripping down the face.
I have to say, my 2 favourites, there was a wonderful one of a Brazilian fan clinging on to the World Cup in the stands, and there was an awful one of a little boy who had his glasses and he had his hands to his eyes like this, and his glasses were pushed over his head as he wiped the tears away from his eyes.
Was that the problem? Was it just too much emotion? Was it just too emotional from the Brazilians?
Even if they lost 2-1 or 3-1, the reaction would have been fairly similar, wouldn't it?
I think they were shell-shocked. I think to have that number of goals scored that quickly, they were 5-0 down by the 25-minute mark. And it was painful to watch. Literally every time the Germans got the ball for a period of about 5 or 6 minutes.
They feel the pain more than most, though, don't they? In Brazil,
well,
is that
I think
true to say?
For a whole load of reasons, they feel the pain more than most. They haven't lost at home on home soil. I think for 1920 or something absolutely.
I don't know the statistics.
They hadn't lost for so long at home in a competitive match, and then they went out and suffered the worst defeat that's ever been seen in a World Cup semi-final, which is not the place to do it.
No, and of course the big debate is, would it all have been different if Neymar had on the pitch? But we will never know.
Well, interesting. I saw Steven Gerrard tweet. He said Brazil have Neymar, Portugal have Ronaldo, Argentina have Messi, and the Germans have a team.
Very briefly,
Very good
Mark,
comment,
your
very good
thoughts on this
comment.
very sad final story in the China Daily about this rise that we're seeing in trophy safari hunting on the part of the
I
Chinese.
find this absolutely amazing that this is happening today, let alone that it's on the rise. I thought that there was a broad understanding of wildlife today that perhaps didn't exist years ago. There were 2,000 white rhino in 1960. There are 20,000 now, but that's because there has been a big effort to preserve the species. And now suddenly that it's in a position where it is off the endangered list, suddenly it's fine to promote the idea that you hunt them. I think it's extraordinary.
It's desperately sad, isn't it? Mark, many thanks. Mark Davies, there, CEO, strategy consultant, Camberton. Good to have you with us in the papers. Do stay with us. Lots more from Sally.
Have a lovely day. Bye-bye.